Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first monthly lecture of this academic year. It's a great pleasure to have Holly Case with us. She is a fellow at the Institute and opens this year's series of monthly lectures. She is, as one would say, between jobs. She's moving currently from Cornell, where she has been teaching history. And after she finishes with us here in Vienna, she moves to Brown. She's a historian of Europe who specializes on modern Eastern and Central, but also Southeastern Europe. Some of you may know her work. It's really wide-ranging. She's worked on questions of diplomacy, foreign policy, social policy, also issues of culture, science, literature. Today, we're going to hear her on one of the questions, which has been, or we're going to hear her on the age of questions, so it's a meta discussion of questions. The book, which many of you may know, is on the Transylvanian question and the European idea during the Second World War. She's edited a very well-known volume on Yugoslavia and its historians, understanding the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. The edited issue of the journal is on the global impact of 1989. Holly's work has covered very many areas of European history. We're going to venture with her today into the realm of a whole set of questions from the women's question, the women's question, as it was called, about the Jewish question, the Eastern question, the question of nationality, and Holly has turned it into the age of questions. Most European thinkers whom we can think of at that time were addressing some and many, several of these questions. So this is going to be social history, political history, but also a history of modern European thought. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to first hearing about the questions and then getting a few answers. I forgot, which is that we are live streaming, so please make sure that your handies are on an airplane mode. Thank you.
Prepare for takeoff. So, thank you, Shalini, for the wonderful introduction, and for others at the EVM for inviting me to give this lecture, and especially to the staff here at the EVM who've been really welcoming and very kind. And I want to especially thank Anna, who's done a wonderful job on so many fronts. And to my new friends here at the EVM who make it all worthwhile. And also, it's generally a great honor to be here. So thanks for coming to all of you. I imagine that you've all heard the phrase, the final solution. And you also probably know that the final solution is the end of something. It's the end of a phrase. So, or I should say it's the final solution to the Jewish question. And when we think in terms of the final solution, there are a couple of peculiar things. One is, why is it that a question should have a solution? We're accustomed to thinking of questions in terms of answers rather than solutions. And why a definitive or a final one? There are a lot of peculiarities about the Jewish question, and I hope to address some of these here. But what I'm more interested in generally is whether there was something about this formulation, which I would broadly call the X question. So you know that there's nothing new about questions. They're basically as old as language. So the Socratic method used questions as a logical strategy. The scholastics of the late medieval period also used questions, or they had these questii. Religious catechisms would work on giving information about the scripture or relaying scriptural doctrine through questions, and the national academies that sprang up in the 19th and 18th centuries also had question competitions where they would pose a question and people would have to write in with answers. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, something happened that questions got a little weird. And a new kind of question emerged on the scene. And this is what I would roughly call the X question. So if you put in for the category of X something like Jewish, woman, worker, oyster, there was an oyster question, cotton, there was a cotton question, slavery. I have not managed to reach the end of this, what X can cover. Recently, I found a reference to the Chicago saloon question, and I thought I had hit a frontier there, literally and figuratively. But I'm sure I will find others. A lot of these questions, or a couple of them, were born in the 18th century. So the first one I've been able to find is the American question. It was roughly about whether the 13 colonies should be independent from Britain. That was quickly, quote unquote, solved with the American Revolution, although it came back in various forms. And then came the Catholic question in Britain, which was, what to do with the Irish, roughly speaking. And that became the Irish question. But those were sort of isolated cases, and they had, in some respects, their own trajectory. I would say what I call the age of questions really came online in a major way in the first decade of the 19th century and as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. Then you get a flood of questions. So in Britain you get the bullion, the corn, the population questions that are sort of about figuring out how to finance the Napoleonic Wars. You also get the treaty negotiations have a series of questions that they lay out that have to be considered at the Congress of Vienna of 1814 and 1815, questions like the Turkish question, the Polish question, and a slew of others are being addressed. There's a Spanish question that comes up at this time. And by the time you get to the 1820s and the 1830s, it's not just treaty negotiations, and it's not just high diplomacy. It's the publicistic realm, more broadly speaking. So newspaper articles, pamphlets in massive numbers are being published on all kinds of questions. And so here are some of the ones that I've found, but these are really some of the more prominent ones, except I threw in the oyster one for good measure. It was a big deal in the 19th century, but it's hard to recall now why. But you can see some of these you'll recognize that were incredibly hot for a time and that we might not have a firm grasp of now. But I would say among the most important that defined the era in some respects and that subsumed other questions underneath them, the Eastern question was massive. The social question encompassed also a slew of other smaller questions like the woman, the worker, the agrarian question were often subsumed under this big umbrella category of the social question. The Eastern question was another umbrella that subsumed the Balkan question, Macedonian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Greek. Sometimes it was called the Russian question. Sometimes it was also referred to as the Austro-Hungarian question as being related. And so these were big umbrella categories. And another one that came into existence in the course of all of this was the European question. And we'll get to that in a second. What's remarkable about this age is that so many people, just about anyone you can imagine in the 19th century who was anyone, probably wrote something about questions. So Thomas Robert Malthus, Alexis de Tocqueville, Giuseppe Mazzini, Karl von Clausewitz, Karl Marx, Karl May, Karl Kraus, every Karl. Otto von Bismarck, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leopold von Ranke, Leo Tolstoy, Leon Trotsky, all of the Leopolds as well. Rosa Luxemburg, Robert Musil, Joseph Conrad, and that's just to name a few. Just basically pick a figure in the 19th century and they probably weighed in on one, possibly on more questions. And so somebody like Karl Marx or Dostoevsky, as near as I can tell, they tried to hit them all. And so already in 1893, this is Tolstoy, wrote I constantly receive from all kinds of authors, all kinds of pamphlets, and frequently books. One has definitively solved the social question, another the political question, another the Eastern question, and so on. And you can see the tone of exasperation, and this is already in 1893. Stop it already with the questions. But Tolstoy himself has a long section in Anna Karenina where he lays out his own views in the voice of Levin on the Eastern question. Dostoevsky writes about the sewer question in Crime and Punishment. And so questions were really everywhere. They couldn't be gotten around. And the trend continued. And so in some respects, and you can see by Tolstoy's exasperation, it's kind of difficult for scholars also to stifle a yawn when they hear the phrase, the X question. And not because these questions failed to elicit enthusiastic engagement, but precisely because there's been so much of it. And there are so many scholarly fields that have basically gone to waste or wound themselves into circles over this or that question. If you consider a question like the Jewish question or the Polish question, or even the Eastern for that matter, there are whole fields of scholarship that continue to debate these very hotly. And as a matter of fact, one prominent Polish historian once said that the Polish question for Poland is a fundamentally barren subject. And Greek, for example, the phrase, "you've made an Eastern question out of it," Anatoliko zitimato ekanes, it's a common idiom in modern Greek that means you've made a mountain out of a molehill. So you've essentially made something out of nothing. You're getting all worked up about nothing. But for all of the mountains that have been made out of molehills around questions, it's interesting that nobody has really asked, where did all of these questions come from? And more, perhaps even more interestingly, where did they all go? Because it seems clear that even though we sometimes see a question pop up now and again, we're definitely not in the phase where they're everywhere and pervasive. So today I'd like to consider this appropriately question from the standpoint of certain patterns I've observed in what I call the age of questions. So for the most part, 19th century questions were synonymous, as I pointed out, with problems, which therefore rhetorically begged solutions rather than answers or opinions. And if you look at the roots of the word in both Latin and Greek, these two definitions of question as interrogative and question as problem are already there. And if you think of your own language, whether the word for question overlaps also with the word problem, in most languages it does, although there are a couple of exceptions that I can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. But this conflation between question and problem that comes up in the X question can be seen in the writing on them. So in 1921, a couple of American priests wrote what was called the Catechism of the Social Question, and it opens with this. Question, what do we mean by the social question? Answer, a question denotes a problem or a difficulty which demands a solution. And insofar as they were problems, they were also irritating. Something needed to be done about them. You couldn't just leave them alone. They needed to be addressed. And so in a letter from 1854, the French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville compared engagement with the Eastern question to banging one's head against the wall. This is my translation from the French. C'est faire casser la petite fiole sur la tête. Here you can see the difference between English and French. In French, it's you hit yourself with a little bottle on the head. And in English, it's bang your head against the wall. But in any case, it's irritating, and you can see that in both cases, it's quite annoying. The Russian Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote an entry in his diary of a writer in which he said, the Eastern question is like a piccola bestia that has produced a condition of general madness. Karl May, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with, that's him, aka Karaben Nemsi, and who is the German author of many immensely popular novels about America's western frontier. In his travel memoir from 1882, From Baghdad to Istanbul, the following exchange appears. What do you make of the Eastern question? I think they should mark it not with a question mark, but with an exclamation point. Basically, that these are so shrill and they're so intense that it doesn't even make sense to treat them as interrogatives. And as a matter of fact, people who posed questions, I use the word for them that is querists, which is in partially the word that was used at the time, but I also use it because it gets at some essential feature of questions. The word querist implies something like an impertinent or an insatiable or a troublesome questioner, somebody who is always asking. And Elias Canetti, I've been tried to throw in some, at least some people with some associations with Austria, who wrote The Crowds and Power in 1960, has a chapter entitled Question and Answer. And he writes, all questioning is intrusion. Where it is wielded as a means of power, it cuts into the body of the questioned, for the effect of questions on the querist is an elevation of his sense of power. They give him the desire to pose still more and more questions. And the more he yields to the questions, the more the question subordinates himself. And so there's something insistent and persistent about this form of the interrogative that is registered by a lot of people simultaneously. And as a matter of fact, at the end of his chapter on questions, Canetti included a strange anecdote from Slavic mythology, and it relates to the so-called noon witch or poludnica. And the noon witch is a demon in Slavic mythology that visits upon peasants at the noon hour when when the sun is high and it's very hot, and so they're at the greatest risk of heat stroke. And so she's sort of the mythological incarnation of heat stroke. She drives you crazy and then you die, effectively. And so the anecdote or the snippet from mythology is that a man is sitting in a pasture next to his sleeping bride. Then comes the noon witch at noon and starts asking him questions. And as much as he answered, she just kept asking new ones and more and ever more questions. And as the clock strikes 1, the man's heart stopped, and the noon witch has questioned him effectively to death. And so questions were in sort of the subconscious of the European intellect, something that came to be feared after a time. But let's go back and talk a bit about their origins and what characteristics they had. So I mentioned that some of the earliest mentions of questions come from the Napoleonic context, so the corn and bullion questions. And it's tempting to start a definition, to offer a definition of these. So let's say American question is about American independence. Jewish question is about the emancipation of Jews. Eastern question is about what to do with the Ottoman Empire. But I think part of the reason one should resist this tendency to say definitively what these questions were is because in this 19th century field where people were talking about them all the time, one of their tricks was every time an intervention was made on a question, it was the task of the querist to define it. And the definition was part of their way of presenting the proper solution. And so these questions were perpetually being defined and redefined depending on who was talking about them. So they have some general characteristics that might hold them together, but one of the biggest characteristics is that they're constantly changing, that every querist is going to pose it a different way in order to stake a claim to why their solution should be the one that's chosen. So why is it that this happens in the 1830s? Why doesn't it happen during the French Revolution? Because if it's about emancipation or independence, the French Revolution would kind of make sense. And besides, it's European history. Doesn't everything come from the French Revolution? Well, not this. I've always wanted to say that. I think instead the reason why it really takes off in the 1830s is for two reasons, and the convergence of two factors. One is an enhanced appeal to public opinion in the discussion of parliamentary questions, and this has to do with the fact that in Britain there's a reform law being discussed about the expansion of the franchise. In France there's a revolution going on in 1830, again discussions about expansion of the franchise, and there's also a burgeoning of the popular press during this time period. Plus, there are lots of other strange things going on. In Poland, there's an important uprising against Tsarist Russia. In Greece, there's an ongoing or just ending conflict between emergent Greece and the Ottoman Empire. In Algeria as well, there is geopolitical foment. And so there are a lot of places. Belgium also is just being established at the time. There are lots of things that kind of happen simultaneously that give rise to this sense that not only it has a lot become open, but also that it's possible to talk about it in the press. Because there is a press, there is something like a popular press, and people start to think that the public opinion matters. If the public can sway members of parliament, then decisions can be made that will affect the outcome of X and Y, etc. And this was true even of geopolitical questions. So, for example, Poles, even though they didn't have a state, lobbied in France, lobbied in Britain to try to get their message out in the British and French press because they thought Britain and France would be the ones to put Poland back on the map, if anyone would. So there are features of questions also, and we've talked about how there's something like problems that relate them to science. So when we're thinking problem solution, there's a kind of mathematical understanding that we get from that. So that pairing problem solution sounds like an equation, and as a matter of fact, a lot of the way that people, querists, talk about questions is in mathematized terms. And they talk about formulas, they talk about equations, they talk about solutions, single definitive solutions, for example. And the mathematized understanding of the workings of the world was manifest in a particular phrase, which was 2 + 2 is 4. It's as obvious as 2 + 2 is 4 that the French Revolution should have succeeded in X or Y way, or that Belgium should have its independence, or that Greece should have its independence. It's as obvious as 2 + 2 is 4. And so prevalent was this usage as a way of arguing for why something should happen, that Fyodor Dostoevsky, writing in 1864 in his novel Notes from Underground, decried its insidious pervasiveness. Twice 2's 4, watches smugly, stands in the middle of your road with his arms akimbo and spits. And if you can imagine 2 + 2 is 4 doing this, I think it's a very rich image. So, but one thing starts to happen towards the second half of the 19th century. And even Dostoevsky, who didn't like 2 + 2 is 4, still himself can't avoid using this language of formulas and solutions. So he wrote ecstatically of the final solution to the Eastern question. With the final solution of the Eastern question, all other political strife in Europe will be terminated. The formula, the Eastern question, comprises, perhaps unknowingly to itself, all other political questions, perplexities, and prejudices of Europe. So you can also see him trying to create a mega theory, a mega math that accounts for everything and that solves everything. And that is tied into the Eastern question. And so one of the things I'd like to ask is, what kinds of thinking did this formulation make possible? So we've talked a bit about mathematical thinking behind problem and solution, but by the time the age of questions was really in full swing, mathematical models for understanding society were starting to lose their grip in favor of biological models. So diagnostic, like something's sick and you have to diagnose the ills. And it was rather subject-specific, rather than the universalism of math that portended that every situation in any given context is the same, and so you can unite it in a single mathematized way. Whereas the diagnostic medical model suggests that, well, this question might manifest itself differently here and there, depending on the way the organism is handling it. So one symptom of this transformation, questions become increasingly synonymous with maladies or sicknesses. So in 1846, there's a pamphlet on the Polish question that refers to it as the Polish malady. And then not just with geopolitics, but also with the social question, the scientific metaphor pops up. So Ernst Becher in 1868 writes, "Society is sick." Then comes the question regarding the causes, character, and cure of the sickness, the social question. And this, we've had a couple of pairings so far. Problem, solution, that questions were like problems. And then we've had this notion that there's a shift from math to medicine, which we'll return to. But before we do that, I would like to talk a bit about another pattern. And this is a pattern of what I would call aggregation. And this started very early on. And it basically, when I said that the 1830s were a big deal in the age of questions, it was because so many of them came up simultaneously. And it's not just that they came up simultaneously, but when they were mentioned, when they were invented, so to speak, people mentioned them in connection with one another. So people would talk about how there's a strong relationship between the Eastern question and the Polish question, or that the Belgian question is essentially the same as the Polish question. And this starts to make sense when you think of the way that a question is posed as speaking to its solution. So if you know that Belgium gets independence and you relate the Polish question to the Belgian one, then what you're implying is that Poland too should have independence. So this was really a strategy on the part of querists of the time to string together questions so that they could imply solutions by association if one of them had been addressed or solved in a certain way. But this has a very peculiar side effect. And one of these side effects is that it creates umbrella questions, big ones that start to be like the aggregate bundles of questions. So I mentioned these before, the Eastern question, the social question, the nationalities question, and then the big European question that emerges out of a combination of other questions. And so you'll see someone saying like, the worker question is just a part of the social question, which encompasses within itself the most important questions of ethics, philosophy of law, and statecraft. So you can see them getting megalomaniacal about what questions encompass and what they mean. And this megalomania is transferred then to solutions. And so once you see the Greek question as connected to the Polish, as connected to the Belgian, then you have to conceive of a solution that doesn't just address the Greek or the Belgian or the Polish, but you have to come up with a big omnibus solution that will take them all on. So if you remember when Dostoevsky says that the Eastern question combines neatly so many other questions, and that if you just address this one, then you've got the key to the whole thing. And so these big umbrella questions become the focus, and a huge burden is placed on them to basically transform the entirety of the continent, sometimes of the world. And so this little strategy that querists use to get their preferred solution ends up taking on a life of its own and produces this kind of aggregation mania that demands bigger and bigger solutions. So Karl Marx knew that to formulate a question was to imply its solution. In 1843, he responded to the first text in German, one of the first in any languages, to address the Jewish question, or I should say one of the first texts. And it was an article by the German theologian Bruno Bauer. And in his famous response to Bauer, Marx wrote, "The formulation of a question is its solution." This notion that somehow all you had to do is get the formulation right and you have already implied solution suggested a kind of magical power that language could have. And this presumed magical power was discussed regularly thereafter. So the German political scientist Adolf Grabowski reiterated how defining questions was to propose a solution. He said, Once the problems are comprehensively and clearly grasped, they will steer themselves towards solution. Language thinks in a very subtle manner here. It calls the correct answer to a question a solution. The unraveling is thus at once the achievement, and hence language views the amalgamation of successful unraveling towards a beneficial result as a completely natural achievement. And so you can see Quercus endowing language itself with some kind of history-moving capacity that works more or less on its own. It doesn't need an agent, and it functions more or less like a machine. So it also is the case that for some, the question, the formulation isn't the solution. The question itself becomes the solution, and then things get really automatic. So the Russian naturalist and philosopher Nikolai Danilevsky, in his work Russia and Europe from 1869, wrote this: "If we look at Russian life, we quickly see that it is not in complete health. The curative events from which we will learn our saving lessons have already appeared on the horizon of history and are called the Eastern question." And so it's not that formulating it will solve the Eastern question. The Eastern question itself is the solution to all of our problems. And this peculiar automatism that the age is endowed with carries through into later periods, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So in 1923, the Austrian philosopher and geopolitician Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi published a book entitled Pan-Europe, and in it he posed what he called the European question, which he formulated as follows: "Can Europe, so long as its political and economic disunion lasts, maintain its peace and independence with respect to the growing world powers, or is it bound, in order to preserve its existence, to organize itself into a federal union?" And so just like Marx before him and Grabowski also before him, Coudenhove-Kalergi argued that to put the question is to answer it, and the answer was that a federal union of European states was absolutely necessary. So I've already talked about how this habit of aggregation has a knock-on effect with solutions. So it's not just that questions get really big, it's that solutions get really big. And so the gathering into bundles demanded not a little tweak here or a little policy change there, but massive overhauls on a truly international. From 1840, the French publicist François Dumont proposed just such a solution to the Eastern question. The present condition of Europe in a political as well as a social sense is rotten at its core and is based on a false premise. It lacks balance and thus cannot endure. Europe must be reconstituted. Then and only then will the peace of Europe and the world be assured. However, to arrive at this regeneration, only two means present themselves: a general war and a war of principle, or what would be better for everyone, a good-natured and rational alliance. So he mentions two options, but some later on become romanced by the possibility or the dread of the general war. So the perceived need for a general war, and here I'm saying perceived need because on the one hand, you want to avoid a general war, and that's why you have to solve all of these questions, because if you don't solve them, there's going to be a general war. By the same token, you can't solve them unless you achieve a total social and geopolitical reset because you've made them so big. And the only way you can achieve a total social and geopolitical reset is if you have a universal war. And so the age starts to push in two diametrically opposed directions simultaneously. It needs to avoid the war. It argues for solutions in order to prevent the big oncoming universal war, and yet it needs the war in order to have these big omnibus solutions. So the same year that Dumont writes, another man by the name of Leopold Sawaskiewicz wrote of the Polish question, "All the leading political events of Europe are more or less involved in this question," and he asserted that the Eastern and Polish questions could only be solved together, and that all Eastern commotions have become of vital importance to the Western nations, and that the present one should be made a question of a general war. The Polish Romantic poet Adam Mickiewicz put forward a similar position in 1849, The Eastern question arises with a somber grandeur. A general war can result from it. And we know something about Mickiewicz's views on a general war from a poem that he wrote in 1830 during the November uprising against Tsarist Russia. For a universal war for the freedom of peoples, we beseech thee, O Lord. And as the Crimean War was starting in the 1850s, some tended to see this one as possibly the one that was going to do it. And as a matter of fact, Mickiewicz was so excited that he went to try to fight in this war, and he ended up dying more or less en route. And an 1855 pamphlet by a German statesman on the Polish question viewed from the German perspective declared that this colossal struggle cannot be ended other than by a complete change in the alliances of all states as well as in their boundaries. So you can see, he's talking about the Polish question, and yet this colossal struggle cannot be ended other than by a complete change in the alliances of all states as well as in their boundaries. So there's a sense that everything has to be started over, done away with, and that something new has to come into existence. And so this aggregation produced this kind of fear, but also sense of opportunity when it came to universal war. But because an omnibus solution was sought, what's an omnibus solution? It's eliminating borders, which is what is discussed here, which is federation. And so a commonly discussed solution to these big umbrella questions comes to be federation. So in 1863, Elias Regnault published a pamphlet in Paris whose title ran "The European Question Inappropriately Called the Polish Question," in which he proposed a federal Europe, strong, compact, of unified sentiments, morals, and intellectual knowledge as a solution. Indeed, for any question there is a solution at the ready, wrote Regnault. Federalism answers everything because it simplifies everything. The federal principle should be the new international law of Europe. So the ideal of federation also found its way into discussions of period social questions, or the social question, although these were not first and foremost about boundaries and geopolitics. And yet, in the words of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, the social question can be resolved only by abolishing state boundaries. Coudenhove-Kalergi himself wrote that the separation between nation and state that would accompany the creation of Pan-Europe would everywhere facilitate economic recovery as well as the solution of the social question. It will rid Europe's political atmosphere of its poisonous elements and prepare it for the Pan-European solution. So you can see, on the one hand, universal war, on the other hand, federation as this form of total reset that's being proposed as a result of aggregation. But another aspect of the drive to aggregate questions, to see them as interrelated, was what I would call concerted action. The belief that it was possible to bundle questions and thereby reduce them to a single common denominator, solving them in one stroke, meant that they also demanded that a lot of actors be involved in that process. It couldn't just be one state. It couldn't just be domestic policy. There had to be a kind of choreographed performance, a dance around particular questions. So the German historian Leopold von Ranke saw what he called a unanimous accord emerge around the interactions of Europe's powers with respect to the Eastern question. In 1879, a work that he wrote on Serbia and Turkey in the 19th century, he wrote about an episode from the 1830s, a drama without equal. These powers equipped for war as never before, how they move against one another, engage in disputes, join alliances and counter-alliances, put an end to a distant world's questions at the least irritation, and thereby avoid entering into open battle with one another, and not just one or the other power, but the whole of Europe. So Europe's own unity was to be forged around addressing 19th century's big bundle of questions, such that in 1907, the British liberal statesman Noel Buxton wrote of the Macedonian question as a subset of the Eastern. Macedonia raises thoughts of a nobler cause than the relief of suffering alone, for it recalls no less a matter than that of reviving once more the comity of nations. In spite of all the rivalries aroused, Macedonia compels the powers to work together, and to peoples whose officers cooperate in the same police force, the thought of war seems increasingly absurd. The very perplexities of the task may be but the birth throes of a new unity. So working together to solve questions, which was necessary because they were so bundled, was also going to be the thing that could help bring about this big federal solution. It was the basis, or the combined to solve of possibility. Okay, there was also another feature that tied together East and West in the Age of Questions, but it tied them together in a very peculiar way. So we've been talking a lot about Poland, the Polish question and the Eastern question, big geopolitical questions on the east, in the east of Europe. And when we think about what's going on in Western Europe at the time, we think the social question is one of the primary ones, maybe the Jewish question as well. And what is interesting is that the querists of the 19th century saw an interrelationship between the geopolitics of the East and the social politics of the West. They saw these questions as being in some kind of relation to one another. And you can see this in a couple of exchanges. So in March of 1853, the Crimean War is just on the horizon, and the newly appointed Secretary of State, British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, the Earl of Clarendon, he sent a dispatch to the British Prime Minister to Russia, and in it he sought to assure the Russian leadership that Britain had no hostile intentions. The main object of Her Majesty's government, that to which their efforts have been and always will be directed, is the preservation of peace. And they desire to uphold the Turkish Empire from their conviction that no great question can be agitated in the East without becoming a source of discord in the West, and that every great question in the West will assume a revolutionary character and embrace a revision of the entire social system for which the continental governments are certainly in no state of preparation. And so you can see that he believes absolutely that if you change a border in the East, you're going to set off the revolution in the West. That these issues are intimately related and that there's no way to disambiguate them. So Clarendon's dispatch surfaced a year later and became a matter for public debate when Britain's involvement in the war erupted into something like domestic controversy, and the debate surrounded or went around 1,300 pages of official documents that had more or less been leaked relating to the period leading up to the war. And in April of 1854, Karl Marx, writing on the Eastern question under a pseudonym for the New York Tribune, was among those to comment on the British Foreign Secretary's now published dispatch. And Marx paraphrased Clarendon: Her Majesty's government desires to uphold the Turkish Empire, not from any Eastern consideration at all, but from their conviction that no great question can be agitated in the East without becoming a source of discord in the West. Note how he italicizes that. That's his italicization. The brave Earl goes further. Why does he fear a war with France, which he declares must be the necessary result of the dissolution and dismemberment of the Turkish Empire? A war with France, considered in itself, would be a very pleasant thing, but there is this delicate circumstance connected with it. Every great question in the West will assume a revolutionary character and embrace a revision of the entire social system. And so you can see Clarendon and Marx are not on the same end of the political spectrum, yet they absolutely share. We know how Karl Marx felt about the possibility of a revision of the entire social system. He was okay with it, Clarendon was not, but what's remarkable is that they both absolutely believe that this is true, that if you tweak a border in the East, that the social fabric of the West, the social question, will explode, and that there's no way to avoid it. So there's one last feature that I'd like to talk about that happens in the late 19th century. And I mentioned how questions were becoming biologized, which meant that they were being referred to as maladies. They were sicknesses that had to be cured. There are a couple of ways you can think about a sickness. One is it's something that's going to kill you, in which case you only have one. Or you can have a chronic sickness that you might get better and it might come back. And both of these metaphors are being used. But one thing that happens as a result of using medical metaphors is that people stop believing in final solutions. There's really no final solution to sickness. You can cure it and you can put off something like the biological decay, but you can't put off the end, right? And so this belief in the definitive solution starts to disappear. And people start to think that you have to address questions constantly, and that you have to, because otherwise they'll cause trouble, but you can't necessarily solve them definitively. And so in 1868, Ernst Becker writes, "Each time has its own tasks to fulfill, its own questions to solve, which sum up the character and meaning of that time. The struggle and pursuit of what is newer and better, the battle of other ideas and principles against the legacy of vanquished forms of life and axioms, but nowhere yet nearing completion." So you have to keep doing it, but you will never, ever finish, and that's part of the point. So in Robert Musill's novel Man Without Qualities, written over the 1930s and the 1940s, the narrator writes of the character Ulrich that he had been accustomed his whole life to expect politics to bring about not what needed to happen, but rather at best only what should have happened long ago. Even the social question appeared to him not as a question, but rather as an omitted answer. But he could name 100 other such questions on which the mental files had long since been closed, and yet awaited manipulative processing in the office of dispatch in vain. And this passage appears in Man Without Qualities, which many of you already know is a famously incomplete novel. So he doesn't even finish the novel, much less solve the questions. So one of the metaphors that starts to rise then is that questions are not really like a sickness so much as they are like hunger. You can address it, but it's going to come right back. So in a book on the social question from 1919, the German theosophist Rudolf Steiner used a biological metaphor to make the same point. Just as an organism becomes hungry sometime after being full, so does the social organism proceed from order to disorder. There can be no more of a universal medicine for maintaining order in social relations than there is a food that will satisfy for all times. The social question, though hardly a new development in human societies, had to be solved repeatedly and differently each time in accordance with the conditions of that time. And as such, it was a component of the entire recent life of civilization, in the words of Steiner. So, if people had given up on final solutions, why, at just the moment that they have, after World War I, with Musil, with Steiner, why is it just then that we have the final solution? And I think part of the reason is because largely people had given up on final solutions in regular terms. The great universal war had arguably already happened twice, Crimea and World War I. And there was a huge amount of transformation that took place in the course of both, and some were satisfied with these transformations, others were not. And what is remarkable about what Hitler and the Nazis did was that they basically recreated the Age of Questions in miniature and on cocaine, in the sense that they really ratcheted up the queristic model and accelerated it massively. So Hitler created a question bundle of his own. And so oftentimes when we think about World War II, we think, well, Hitler's primary preoccupation was the Jewish question, and that was his thing, and the final solution was the primary legacy of World War II, and that definitely makes sense. But it is also important to consider that this was one of many questions that Hitler raised, and that he related them, as the Age of Questions had done, to one another, such that you couldn't address the others without addressing this one, and vice versa. And so basically he started already in the 1930s. In 1933, just before the Nazis arose to power, he said, "Each of us will pass, but Germany must live, and in order for her to live, all questions of the day must be overridden and certain preconditions established." So he set up this mandate that every question needs to come up for review again and needs to be solved in a different way. And he actually went about doing that. So by design, among the first were the racial and the Jewish questions domestically, very hotly discussed. And acted upon, which by design acquired an international scope because they became the emigrant question as the people being driven out of the country then became emigres. And then came the Saar question relating to the status of the Saarland, around which there was a huge burgeoning literature. Then the Austrian, the Sudeten German, and the Danzig questions, and so on and so on. And as question followed questions, Hitler repeatedly claimed that this is the last one. After this, there aren't going to be any more, and then proceeded to raise another one almost immediately after that. And one need look no further than the pamphlets, diplomatic exchanges, and international and national parliamentary debates of the period to witness the explosion of questions in the 1930s and 1940s. The colonial, Macedonian, Transylvanian, Romanian, Czech, Russian, Bessarabian, Thracian, Dalmatian, Ukrainian, Somaliland, Albanian, Balkan, Mediterranean, Danube, Turkish, Medjugorje, North African, Lithuanian, Banat, Greek, and Dobruja questions, all of them saw a spike in discussion and largely in connection with the changing of boundaries and also the war that was being brought about as a result of Nazi aspirations. So in conversation with the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, in November of 1940, Molotov noted with some incredulity to Hitler that the Nazis had thrown up a series of questions relating not merely to Europe, but beyond that, and also to other areas of the world. And there is sort of as well, a kind of perverse version of federative scheming as well in the Nazi model. So in a discussion again with Molotov, Hitler said that to the end of European unity, which would be a Europe united under German hegemony, to this end, all the tensions between the members of this community of interest must be eliminated or at the very least neutralized. For that, it's necessary to clarify a whole series of questions. The questions were basically the means of achieving, in his mind, this longed-for European unity. So I'd like to turn back to another, possibly nicer Austrian at the end, and not to leave you with that. And that is that Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who wrote Pan-Europe in 1923, had a very different vision of a European federation, but one that was also informed by this kind of sense of aggregation, but it was formed by a war that had recently ended rather than one that was imminent. He said, tomorrow perhaps it may be too late for the settlement of the European question, and it is better therefore to begin today. The rapidity of the movement towards the unification of Europe is quite as important as its existence, for it depends upon the rapidity of this movement, whether Europe will be a union of states or a collection of ruins. So, just to conclude, my mission here has been to demonstrate how this thinking in questions, which started in earnest in the 1820s and 1830s in Europe, really structured Europeans' thinking about the desirable and, more importantly, about the possible and the necessary, what they felt could be done and what they felt had to be done, and how a lot of this was informed by a structure that emerged. This structure of the question formulation, and one in which ideas that would seem to adhere to a particular question, so final solutions, federal solutions, the threat of universal war, radical reorganization of the European state and social order, the relationship between the social and the geopolitical, and between East and West, how all of these ideas migrated through questions into other realms, and that you can only see this if you look at questions in aggregate rather than in isolation. And then the picture of the 19th and 20th century, I think, rather fundamentally changes. And so with that, I'd like to open it up to questions appropriately. Thank And so thank you very much. That's Warsaw.
So, Holly, thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over to the floor for questions. We need to take the mic to you.
Hi, Dan Brett from the Open University. So I have a question about this raising of questions, and to what extent is it to do with increasing demand for political voice by people, that a lot of these querulous people seem to be on the outside, and they're raising questions as a way to, you're thinking about, in Britain with, say, the Great Reform Act and the constant quest to expand the franchise. These people are sort of saying, well, look, I have questions, I have answers, they're scientific, I'm legitimate, give me more power. Mm-hmm. And why that's going on. The second point is questions falling out of fashion. Like, why do some questions become these overarching dominant questions, like the Eastern question, whereas other questions fall by the wayside? Like, what became of the Chicago saloon question?
Okay. So a couple of voice. And I've struggled with this project for a couple of reasons, because on one level you can look at a lot of these questions and you can say, they're fundamentally about emancipation. So the Jewish question about emancipation of the Jews, the women question about the emancipation of women, even the Eastern question, you could say maybe it's about the emancipation of the Greeks and the Serbs and the Bulgarians and so on. And I was not quite satisfied with this for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that it's generally assumed, although not entirely accurate, I've also discovered, that certain questions come into existence not as a plea for emancipation, but as a reaction against it. So oftentimes people will say that the Jewish question, for example, is only ever posed by people who don't want the Jews to be emancipated. Or the Eastern question, there's a couple of famous lines by people who work in the Ottoman Empire. So an Austrian diplomat said, "In Turkey there is no Eastern question." Or an Ottoman bureaucrat said, this Eastern question is a total fabrication of Western diplomatists. It's not our thing. And so queerism was a way of, if you look at it in an ontological sense, it's a way of throwing someone's whole status or being into question. And so you can just as easily sort of turn that around. On the one hand, it might be related to the claim for voice, but on the other hand, it might be a kind of way of putting a person's entire status into the realm of a question. There's an interesting quote from Christopher Hitchens. He wrote his autobiography. He said, of course, and he's talking about the Irish question here, of course one is flirting with calamity and phrasing things this way, as I learned in school when the Irish question was discussed by some masters as the Irish problem. Again, the word solution can be as neutral as the words question or problem, but once one has defined a people or a nation as such, the search for a resolution can become a yearning for the conclusive, Endlösung, the final solution, that there's something sort of, the formulation might be, there might be something wrong with the formulation in that it creates a problem out of others. And the other concern I have with seeing these questions primarily in terms of emancipation is that I can think of a couple other ways to see them that hold as powerfully. And it's not that these are necessarily the super valid ones, but they are as valid. So you could also see a lot of the rise of questions in the 1830s just as a product of the rise of Russia. It's a geopolitical issue that produces social foment in France. It produces concerns in Britain, as a knock-on effect. It produces the Polish question in no small terms, the Eastern question in no small terms. And so the fact that there is a power emerging and growing in the East has this incredible effect, and that, you know, in some respects has nothing to do with emancipation. There are other forces at play. And so that's part of the reason why I think it is partly about winning political voice, but that's not the sum total of it. So why do questions fall out of fashion? You know, I have a whole chapter on what I call Zeitfragen, you know, that questions have a kind of periodicity, and even the really big ones will sometimes disappear almost completely. If you think of when people are talking about the Eastern question, and you know, I've done some mapping from like Google Books and HathiTrust, and you know, all these aren't super reliable, so I don't use them a lot, but just as a rough schematic, you can see that okay, the Eastern question gets heftily discussed around Crimea and the fallout of Crimea. Big spike in the 1870s, naturally, with you know, the Bulgarian horrors and then the Berlin Congress. And so you can see when there are events that sort of bring these questions into strong focus, and usually it's around big conflicts and wars. And that accounts for some of the periodicity. Why, you know, what happened to the Chicago Saloon question, I have to admit I haven't, you know, like followed that one to the bitter end. But but if I were to say what killed or what has killed the age of questions more generally, and one can debate whether it's over or not, and I could even represent the opposite position for fun if you'd like me to, that it's not over and that actually we might be coming into a new one. But if it is over, if it's largely over, and you know, an argument can be made for that. We don't usually use the terminology that much. It's certainly not as pervasive. We certainly don't use the words final solution without, you know, like hefty grains of salt, or unless we're referring to something very specific historically. But people use the word final solution in the 19th century all the time. I mean, people talked about the final solution to the sugar question, and you know, like that didn't necessarily result in genocide. But the fact that the final solution to the Jewish question was effectively massive genocide, I think, delegitimated in no small part, and you know, for reasons that Hitchens is sort of onto in a slant way, the whole framework, you know, the whole structure of speaking in these terms, that we sort of feel a kind of subconscious, maybe not this way, maybe we don't formulate it this way. But there are still some that exist, and of course the German question was a very big deal in the 80s. And you know, in Turkey there's an Eastern question now. It's related to the Kurds. It's basically the Kurdish question. But occasionally these things will come up, and so one could make an argument that it's not entirely gone. But I think that one thing that can be said is that even the biggest ones had periodicities to them, that they were never solidly and constantly in the public eye.
Hi, Holly.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Thanks so much for this fascinating talk. I mean, I have a bunch of questions in my head as you were speaking, but one of the issues that was crossing my mind, and I was waiting to hear if you would actually address it at some point in your talk, which in my understanding was one of the great questions of the 19th century, which was the origin of mankind. People like Darwin who were thinking about where do we all come from, Max Muller thinking about the origin of language, even sort of the early steps towards anthropology, where do we all come from in the kinds of things we do. How does this question of origins map into this very exciting presentation that you're suggesting here? And somewhat related, this is a minor question, is precisely with the problem of smaller questions, things like the oyster question, which don't necessarily call for an all-pervasive federalist universal war to be solved.
Yeah.
So how does that map or square in your argument? This is really a fascinating talk, and I can't wait to read the book.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, a couple of things. You know, this project is already megalomaniacal. And so I can't, you know, I decided early on I can't just take any use of the word question and consider it my domain. And so I chose, you know, in some respects, a very narrow kind of formulation, which is the X question. If it was formulated like that, as the X question, and that, you know, like that takes a whole bunch of things off the table, which I was sad about. So one thing that it takes off the table is the Russian burning questions. You know, what is to be done? Who is to blame? Which drive Russian politics, through the late 19th century in no small way. And I was so sad that I couldn't include them that I included them a bit, if only to say that I wasn't going to include them. But there are so many ways, directions that one could go. And you mentioned Darwin. It's interesting that he was one of the people who really didn't use this formulation. Him and Spencer. And one thing that given infinite time, I would love to do is try to work out. When is it that what is it that makes people feel comfortable using it or not comfortable using it. And one thing that I have discovered on that front is that people really don't feel comfortable using it as an artistic form. Like there are not very many poems on the social question. It's basically a publicistic genre, and you'll see querists regulating the genre by having conversations about, oh my God, did Tolstoy really write that in, Anna Karenina? That's so, that's a breach of genre. Dostoevsky actually charged him with breach of genre. You don't channel your own opinions on the Eastern question in your novels. And so, and there are a lot of, literary figures who were involved in this age, but what they did basically is they separated their publicistic endeavors and then they used the formulation from their artistic endeavors. But this doesn't prevent people of the time from, bunching that all together and assuming that if someone writes, an anti-slavery novel, that they've addressed the slavery question. So that makes this a dirty category, just all around, because everyone is making their own definition and their own assumption about what's included, what's not included. And so I made that matter sort of my category of analysis, and just to control the amount of material that could be produced. And it produced, the result has been kind of interesting to the extent that if you look at when questions start, so the 1830s, it actually took me a really long time to figure that out because I was getting false indicators everywhere. Because at the moment that they're created, they backdate themselves, sometimes by decades, but oftentimes by centuries. Like they'll say, the first intervention on the Eastern question says, the Eastern question has been around since the time of the Romans. And that's the first time that I've seen that formulation being used. And so they're clearly making assumptions, to define is to solve. That's seminal. How you define it determines how you think it should be solved. And so that was part of the enterprise of the book, was figuring out, why do they define it this way rather than that way? Why do they date it to 1774? And what solution is implied by that dating? And what is implied when they write bibliographies? So there are a bunch of bibliographies of questions, and then you look at the books that are in the bibliographies, there's no question mentioned in them. They might be about, Jews, and it's, the bibliography is of the Jewish question, but they're not about the Jewish question, and in those books, the Jewish question is never mentioned. So they're making their own judgments about what this question means, what it includes, and then you can learn a lot about how they're thinking about it by what they include, what they exclude. And so that's the level at which I've approached this analysis, which has made it, kind of interesting in different ways from if I had pursued every avenue where the word question comes up, but has, I think has been fun nonetheless. The oyster question, so this is an excellent point. Certainly the oyster question didn't produce the drive towards federation. But it is interesting the extent to which there is a kind of formulaic presentation of questions. And I've tried to lay out what this formula was and how it feeds this notion of aggregation. So one aspect of this formula is, first, you say, everyone's talking about the oyster question, and everyone's really worked up about it. And everyone thinks they have the solution, and everyone has got this, magic potion or, one-shot deal that they're going to solve it with. But really, they've just created a bunch of confusion. And I'm here to tell you that it is quite simple, and I'm going to clear away the confusion and show you what the true, that all you have to do is really formulate the question properly, and then the solution will suggest itself. And that is in the oyster question as much as it is in the cotton, in the Chicago Saloon, in the Kansas, in the Alabama, in the Eastern, in the Polish. And this kind of automatism or this redefinition as strategy is in a lot of them. Or most of them, and this sense of repositioning, like that I am going to offer the definitive solution, that I can give you this thing, and also that some great danger looms if we don't address it, and that it's related to others. So even if the oyster question isn't related to the Eastern question, it's often related to the sugar question, for example. And so this lateral associative mania it continues among these other commodities and other questions as well. And that starts very early in the 1810s with the bullion and the corn questions already. I think absolutely, you're right, that you can't derive the whole story that I'm just telling you from the individual parts. It's basically, I would describe it like Wittgenstein describes a game. You kind of know it when you see it, but there are a lot of things that don't have the attributes that you would want to ascribe to a game offhand.
Yeah, thank you for this really interesting meta history of questions, basically. I have 3 short questions. The one is, the way I understood your talk is that the question as a phenomenon is a European phenomenon. 19th century as the century of questions, but the 19th century is also the century of global empires. So my question is, to what extent can we trace these questions across the oceans, basically? Second one is, your material is basically, these are published works, and you talk also very much about the question as a public phenomenon. I wonder to what extent did actually the question matter in internal political debates? I mean, are there any archives? I mean, have you gone to the archives to see if this question becomes a matter in the internal political debates, and does it change the framing of the question? And the third one, I wonder, in regard to this question, what made the question more political or socially sound? To what extent actually power mattered? I mean, all these people who raise these questions, these are not ordinary people. These are very influential intellectuals, politicians. And I mean, I don't think, the way I understand it, not everyone was able to pose a question. So to what extent did actually the aspect of power matter, or to what extent can it help us understanding why certain questions are already long forgotten and others are not? Or thanks.
No, these are excellent. I'll try to cover them quickly. You're absolutely right that actually the first question that I've seen is an overseas question. It's the American. There's another one in the late 18th century, the Carnatic question and the Oud question, which are basically about India or South Asia. I should say. And then there's the Spanish-American question, which is about South America, Latin America. There's the colonial question, which tracks across a lot of the time period under discussion. So it's hugely important. If I were a different kind of historian, I would probably have emphasized, if my area of expertise were different, I would have probably emphasized some of these questions more than the ones that I did, because I was trained as an East Europeanist. But in some respects, I'm not sorry that I am, because I actually think that the biggest question of the 19th century was the Eastern question. This is my view, and part of the reason for that is that it became a cipher for so many other things. It was sort of the giant umbrella question that was cast as the thing that tied them all together. And so it gets way more discussion than the colonial question, than the Algerian question, all of these. And one can talk about periodicity again, but in the 19th century, the Eastern question really rules the roost. And it also is significant because it affects the way that empires view their overseas holdings. So, as near as I can tell, Britain starts the age of questions. And it gets kicked off when the Napoleonic Wars are taking place, which of course have a global scale. But one of the issues that is of concern for Britain during this time period, and why South Asia is such a big deal in the late 18th century already, is because Britain is concerned about Russian expansion. And that these negotiations for the concert of Europe that emerge are really quite essential. And one thing that I think is interesting is how, in the fascination with the colonies, the relationship, of the historiography. I think, the historiography has rightfully swung towards an interest in the colonies, but it's forgotten that there's actually a pretty deep relationship between these old, boring questions like the Eastern question and the Polish question and these other ones. So that, for example, the Polish question was regularly discussed together with the slavery question, or the Eastern question discussed together with ancillary British colonial questions in the same key. And I don't think, the question of whether you can actually separate these matters that are being discussed is secondary in my mind to the fact that they didn't separate them. They saw them as interrelated. And that is what has come to interest me. And that brings me to your second question about what happens when you go look behind the archival wall, which I have, and particularly for Britain, and but also for Hungary. I did a huge case study because I thought Hungary would be a good choice because, A, no one else is going to do it. B, it was part empire, part nation state. C, it was both inside and outside of big geopolitics. It participated in big diplomatic negotiations, but it always felt itself to be underrepresented within those negotiations. It had a huge publicistic boom in the 19th century, and it had its own state administration that produced a lot behind the archival wall. And there are a couple of phenomena that I would say are fascinating when you look behind the archival wall. And that is that sometimes there is a disjuncture between the way questions are discussed behind the wall and the way they're discussed in the publicistic realm. And this makes perfect sense in some respects because, the way they're discussed in the publicistic realm is basically, you could see it as a form of propaganda. I think this solution should be the one, so I'm going to say that it has to be tied to this and this and that. I'm going to define it this way. A lot of the behind the archival wall discussions are like, how do we frame this question so that we convince these people that they should solve it our way? So, in the run-up to World War II, for example, the Hungarians are racking their brains. How do we present this to the British and the Germans before we know who we're going to have to maintain the stronger alliance to, that we should have, that the solution to the X or Y question should be the one that we want rather than the one that the other people want. And this works for the 19th century as well, although in the 19th century, questions don't occur as much behind the archival wall. I see them much more in the 20th century, which is interesting. And they're used as a category of organization, but oftentimes that category is imposed retrospectively. This is not true in Britain and France and Germany. So that the question is used even behind the archival wall, even in discussions in correspondence, letters, and I found a lot of letters between people in the 1810s, early 1800s, talking about, the Catholic question, the Eastern question. And so these correspond almost, they're very similar to some of the early publicistic interventions because they haven't quite worked out, whether this wall is meaningful. But the farther you get on, the more, the fewer in small states that you see this behind the archival, or you don't see much behind the archival wall till the 20th century. But then in spades, like lots and all the time. And they become absolutely huge. So, and one of the aspects of this behind the wall that I find fascinating is that so much of it is spent denying that questions exist at all. That's one thing that I haven't touched upon really that much, is that so much of queristic energy is basically anti-queristic energy, arguing that what you're trying to turn into a question is not a question. Nothing needs to change. Everything is fine as it is. If you like the social and geopolitical order, then you spend a lot of your time arguing with all these querists who are trying to make a big deal out of this stuff. So you talked about power. This is another interesting phenomenon because if you look at the profile of the querist over the 19th century, it's in flux. So you're absolutely right that in the early 19th century it's elites. It's oftentimes members of parliament masquerading as a man of the people. Or, like with a pseudonym and saying, a few words on, the X question, just for anyone who's interested. But as you get farther on into the 19th century, that starts to change. And it changes in a couple of ways. One is who the intended audience starts to be. So one thing that gets introduced on the social question in particular is this whole genre of popular pedagogy, that people talking about the social question feel like they can't talk about it in this hoity-toity way to just, to parliamentarians, you can't solve it that way. And they start to believe that you can't actually solve it in a policy way at all, that you actually have to change people from the inside. And it goes into this thing that I was talking about, that they switch to this biological model that they can't be solved. And that part of it has to come from inside. Like you have to transform the person in order to transform society. And so that means that it has to happen through education. And so all of their interventions are focused on basically public pedagogy. And the Catechism of the Social Question that I showed is basically a form of public pedagogy. So this is breaking down the social question for the common man. Here it is, Q&A, straight out. And then you start to see people actually weighing in on questions who are workers, or a mill owner, or a woman, and they sort of proudly declare that as this person in the late 19th century, they are also bringing their small light to the, to this or that discussion. And then you start getting people talking about, oh, now everybody's talking about it, now just anybody. And it goes into this form where they say, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of, and everybody thinks they can weigh in on this. Well, this is part of what they're reacting to, is the expansion of the queristic field, that a lot more people are participating in it. So there are anecdotes of somebody standing on a soapbox in a town square going on about how Bulgaria needs to be independent and the Eastern question needs to be solved this way or that way. And, he seems like a total fanatic, but these sorts of things started to become thinkable, possible, that, people on the street could have radically strong views about these questions. I think in the 1870s, the big example of that is the Bulgarian horrors, when, domestic British politics basically came to a frenzied pitch around, what was happening in Bulgaria. That the conservatives and the liberals effectively got into a huge election battle over what was happening in Bulgaria, and the Eastern question was at the center of public discussion. So yeah, I think there's a change that takes place in the late 19th century that's significant in that regard.
Okay. Yes, I'm Machteld Venke from the University of Vienna. And you were saying about the 19th century that one believed that if a border is changed in the East, that it can cause a revolution in the West. So that there is this link between a geopolitical question and a social question. And then you came to mention Hitler, and you started off with the Jewish question, and then all of a sudden there are all these border questions coming up again. So you have Danzig, that's in the east, but you also have Saarland, you have Alsace, and so on. So there you have the west. And my question would be, is there still an east and a west in this reformulation of this questions, how they are linked together? Of course, I know that Hitler did annex territories in East and West, and I know there was a genocide, but how was this connection between geopolitics and social questions reformulated?
Fascinating, because I hadn't thought of it in precisely those terms, but I think that you're onto something, that basically something has changed, and I think maybe that something. I'm just going to riff here because I'm speculating, or I'm based on what I know, and that is that one of the first things that Hitler did is that, and this was already well before he came to power, is he said, the social question is actually the one we have to tackle first. And the reason for that is that it's like 2 + 2 is 4. It's obvious. Like he said, that if you don't address the social question of our time, it's like not addressing the slavery question in the 18th century. And this surprised me, like everyone, he implied that everyone at a certain point knew that slavery had to be abolished and that nothing was going to happen until it was abolished. And so if you don't tackle that in that way that, you know, you can't sort of move on. And this really surprised me, A, that he cared about slavery, but B, that he placed such a strong emphasis on the social question. But basically he said that this is what, you know, this is what needs to be done in Germany, and it was a way of making that issue go away. So effectively defanging the potential for revolution by achieving a national level social revolution, so solving the social question for Germans, so that, you know, none of this, so that the social question could not basically arise. So he wanted to take the social effectively out of the question bundle complex, and his assumption was that once you did that, that you had basically a free field to address the ones that, you know, were like essential for let's not speculate as to what he thought was essential, but, you know, statecraft on a massive scale that is, you know, also quite expansionist. But that the social question had first to be addressed. And I think this conception that somehow, you know, this tension between the social and geopolitical that existed in the 19th century was something that he saw as a fundamental problem in the way that Marx and Clarendon saw it, and that he hoped to take off the table so that all that would remain is then, you know, the other questions. And it's interesting how he didn't really define the Jewish question as a social question consistently. He defined it more as a geopolitical one. So he kept saying it's international. You can't solve the Jewish question in one context, you have to solve it in all contexts simultaneously, otherwise it doesn't count. So he basically transformed what many had hitherto considered a social question, not all though, it had been geopolitical for some purposes earlier, but his big thing was to transform it into a geopolitical question. And why he was so keen to have questions strictly in the geopolitical realm is fascinating. I'm trying to think of why he would do that. And perhaps it's because then they cease to be a matter of domestic concern. They are not about the maintenance of a polity. They are about the realm of possibility for expansion for that polity. Although really, again, I'm just speculating right now, but I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm very glad that you asked it, because it will cause me a sleepless night.
I'm Irina Marin from the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. I've got a longer question and a short question. So the longer question is about Hitler's final solution. And I was wondering whether you agree with me with this sort of rationale, that actually rather than turning back the clock to an innocent age of questions, and multiple questions, the Nazi final solution actually represents the tail end of the age of questions, because if you look at their discourse, they're not actually asking questions and giving answers, they're just giving answers, and the question is there just for them to lecture, to preach. So it's almost like a spurious question. I was wondering whether you would agree with this sort of rationale. And the second quick question, have you ever considered, because the phrase questions, la question, so on and so forth, was so catchy, that it might be a Shakespearean turn of phrase, you know, to be or not to be, that is the question. It's been kind of haunting me throughout your lecture, which was fascinating. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is great. So I have to go to, in the book, I actually, I do something like what you said. I imply in one of the chapters that maybe Hitler is sort of the end of the age rather than, and so the question is, if he's the end, is he is his form the fullest consummation of what the age really represented all along, or is it a perversion of that age? And you mentioned the sort of return to the innocent age of questions. On one level, there's a lot of emancipationist drive. There are a lot of people with good intentions in the 19th century, but a lot of the nasty stuff is already there too. This aggregation that has, that needs the universal war. And there's also another phenomenon which I find fascinating. Oops, she's gone to sleep. Is it showing up? Oh. Okay. Oh yeah, actually I cut something, this is to answer your second question, I cut something from this quote, and that was after Waarden, he says, to be or not to be, in English. And the reason I cut it was because, partly I couldn't go down that road. But, one thing I find fascinating about this definition of question is it refers to a question as the essence of something, that's one of the definitions. And there is something to, like, the rabidness with which questions are pursued that places them in a kind of essential position, that assumes that they're the key to everything. And so that, they're the key to also the question to be or not to be, but that's not the question. Somehow. I'll try to, think about some other way to do that. But let me show you another weird phenomenon that I found fascinating. And because you were talking about how, well, he only really gave answers, right? And he didn't pose any questions. Foucault, when he was writing on Kant, because there were all these question competitions in the 18th century where they would ask a question and people would weigh in and they would give genuine answers, like how do you change the system of sewage in Paris? Well, there's not one final solution to that question. There are lots of possible ones. And one thing that Foucault said when he was writing on Kant's What is Enlightenment, because that was the question that Kant's response was formulated to. He said, it's funny, in the 18th century people used to ask questions to which they didn't have answers. And somehow in the 19th century, they started only asking questions to which they already had the answers. And I think the age of questions fits more neatly into that category. Although, if you look at this, so this is the beginning of the age of questions. A plain statement of the Bullion question from 1811. This is a pamphlet by Davies Giddy. And here you can see a list of pamphlets on the Bullion question, or supposedly, but actually a lot of the pamphlets don't have the Bullion question in them. And as a matter of fact, this pamphlet that says a plain statement on the Bullion question, that's the only mention of the Bullion question anywhere. So it's the way that they set up the problem, but it wasn't the way they discussed the problem. Whereas, if you look at the end of the age, or as we get up to World War I, you have this, which is Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat. And this is, look at what it says, Versuch eine moderne Lösung der Judenfrage. But the title is not die Judenfrage. The title is Der Judenstaat. That is the solution, and then the question is discussed within the text. And the same is true of Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europe. You have to wait until page 1 until you see that it's about the European question, because he's loaded the solution on the front page. And so basically, it's all been reversed. And you can see this happening by degrees over this period of this century, that they're already, by the late 19th century, they're already doing this, front-loading the solution, and rhetorically they're doing it much earlier because, of this idea that to formulate is to solve. They're already implying solutions with their very formulations, and they know that that's a trick, or that that's the way to bring about a desired solution. So yeah, I hope that approach is an answer.
I'd like to continue the performing arts act by referring to an article that Larry Wolff wrote a few years ago, where he described Buxton, Edith Durham, and Sutton Watson as ventriloquists, actors, sometimes even perhaps producers of the various questions related to Eastern Europe. You mentioned one of them, the Macedonian question. Mm-hmm. You've given us quite a lot of information about the role of media, the role of politicians like Gladstone. But how does culture, performing arts in particular, which I'm very interested in, how does that work as a medium? Does it have any agency? To what extent do images like the Massacre of Chios, Verdi's operas, and Wagner's very long works, to what extent do they help in framing the question? To what extent do they have agency? Is transformation?
I would say that they may influence what some people understand under the content of certain questions, but like I said earlier in answer to some other question, there's a lot of genre policing that goes on in the queristic endeavor. And I think there's a couple of reasons why, like when we think of questions today, or at least, when I hear the phrase the Eastern question, I sort of, I blanch, my eyes glass over. It's so old and, it's been talked about so many times. And a lot of the discussions were sort of off topic or off the point or, like politically, suspect or in other terms, just problematic. And the same is true, of the Polish question or, the Jewish question. Like there's just been a lot of foam and churn around them, and they don't necessarily feel like they're going anywhere. And after they passed out of life in the real world, let's say in the political realm, they enjoyed like a huge posthumous existence in the academic realm. And so many of these questions are exclusively in the academic realm now. So it's mainly academics who even use the word Jewish question, Eastern question, Polish question, Macedonian question. Like people in Skopje don't walk around, talking about the Macedonian question as a rule, unless they're making a reference to history. And that's not just, I think, because it's solved, but because that's not the mode of public discussion for most things. And so the move of questions into the academic genre is something that I've tried to trace, but it makes for a lot of confusion and muddiness because it's not a smooth transition, and a lot of academics, like the ones you pointed out, are also activists. And so there's a lot of crossover between people who also have particular solutions in mind and who are themselves weighing in. But as you get farther along, I mean, if you look at, I was mentioning Google Books and Ngram Viewer, if you look at like the trajectory of the Jewish question and how many mentions it gets, I said that after World War II it basically dies. Well, if you look at Ngram Viewer, like it takes off in 1945, and that's because everybody starts historicizing it. Like it becomes academic, and then it gets written down in places that get scanned. So it's in every monograph that was ever written on World War II. The Jewish question and the final solution. So ironically, at the moment that they disappear from public discourse, they go viral within academic discussions, but in a more sort of, I would say, padded environment because they're not being discussed as things that, well, we have to solve them, but as, well, what was this and what did it mean to these people? But that doesn't necessarily address your question about the performing arts. I think so it might have influenced the categories, but it would have been, in the same way that it was not okay to write poetry about the Eastern question, really. There are a couple of poems I've found, but they're satirical. It's just, there's an interesting thing about the tone in which this phrase can be used. I mean, can you imagine an operatic scene in which somebody, works their way up a scale and then they get to the Eastern question? They might talk about things relevant to the East and that might come up in the context of a discussion about the Eastern question, but they wouldn't necessarily use that phrase. That would feel like a violation of genre. And they felt these boundaries very keenly. And that's partly what I've been interested in. Why is it that they don't make it into literature? And my hypothesis is, and I've thought about this a lot, and you can sort of see it in the discussions, is that at their origin, questions set themselves off from a previous generation of questions, which were the scholastic questions. And one thing that the scholastic questions had a claim to was some kind of timeless universalism. So what is the meaning of the world? What does God want us to do? I mean, these are big, timeless, universal, huge questions. And there's actually a big argument between a poet and Malthus about the Boolean question, because a poet says, I can't believe that we've gone from asking what God wants us to do to asking, should we set the currency in accordance to, corn prices? What's happened to us that we are now dealing with such questions? And Malthus says basically, Like those scholastic questions have their place, but we are in a time when we have to concern ourselves with practical matters. And so, and with matters that are not just practical, but that are of the time. So they're not timeless, they're not universal, they are very specifically and intentionally and explicitly of their time. So even if they last a long time, and even if you have to solve them over and over again, I mean, you could notice with the hunger metaphor, you have to solve them differently over and over again. They are of their time in that they're always changing with the times. So every time it appears in a different form. And so there's a resistance to seeing questions as kind of timeless. And literature and philosophy are the two genres where you can see people trying to get them over, and they're not succeeding. And literature and philosophy are the ones that are universal and timeless. You know, like these are the genres where you're supposed to, anyway, deal with universal and timeless themes. And the fact that questions can't quite get in there suggests to me that this is the factor. And I would say, I would place, you know, performance arts in something of the same category.
Thank you, Holly, for this really fascinating talk and a wide-ranging one. I stand between you and wine and cheese downstairs, so I don't want to raise a question which should take up too much of your time, but there is a point which I would love to discuss with you, but we can do it downstairs as well, and that is, your focus has very much been on intellectuals, on politicians, on individuals, and what would interest me is you have a 100-year history, and the lens is the question as a form which you then use to think about boundaries between academia and politics, the formation of a public sphere, about expertise, etc. And the question is, institutions are somehow missing from this story, and probably deliberately so. But the question is, for me, listening to you, what is the role of the Royal Society in answering questions? What weight do Akademien der Wissenschaften? Because you are at the stage when these institutions are extremely important actors in producing a certain kind of expertise and expert knowledge. So from a sociology of knowledge point of view, the question would be, what questions get institutionalized, what kinds of academic evidence begins to count, and what kind of authoritative voices do form around questions as communities of experts, where it's not irrelevant who's answering which question. So it's just not in the public domain, but it's in the public domain with very different kinds of weights.
Right.
The voices.
So I would say two things on this point, because this is a great question that I've also sort of hit a little bottle on my head over. And one is that initially debating clubs were very important. But the interesting thing about debating clubs is that they were oftentimes, like they were deinstitutionalized institutions. They were sort of meant to be outside of institutions, and this sort of bled over into what I would call the international public sphere, because the public sphere as it's being formed tries to get outside of formal state affiliations. The international public sphere also tries to move with that kind of flexibility and to have that kind of distance. So if you look at the way that the social question is discussed, for example, one of the earliest mentions that I see of it is in France, and it's in a dictionary with a definition of university. And the definition of the university is like basically a stodgy institution where nothing happens. But, the real place where things happen, the real university of our time, is the social question. And so engagement with questions is a way to free oneself from institutions. And so it has already a kind of like scrappy anti-institutional bent at some of its origins, that it likes being outside, but it also likes informing what's inside. So there's a lot of discussion of questions that takes place in advance of decisions of the National Assembly or of Parliament, for example. So legislative bodies are hugely important for questions, and they're constantly trying to influence people. But I think it's fascinating that a lot of politicians will back away from their MP position to write a pamphlet on X in an anonymous voice as though they're just a casual observer, you know, like from the outside somewhere. It's a lie, absolutely. But the fact that they feel like this is something they have to do and they're operating in the genre is in itself interesting. Plus, somebody like Malthus, you know, he's creating the discipline of political economy, and a lot of disciplines kind of get created around questions. So political economy is one of them. Sociology is huge. So basically, sociology is what happens when questions don't get let into philosophy. That's my theory. Is that they create their own, area where they can be, and that is, for the social question at least, sociology is sort of their home. So institutions, they have a fraught relationship with them, but it's a very interesting one, a rich one. And I'm glad that you posed that question because it's a good one.